You know how you wrote the acknowledgments on your papers? I actually wrote once that I want to thank everybody who contributed to science, all the way back to the guy who invented fire. That's the way we have to look at it.
Right.
It goes back a long way, and you have to be cognizant of that history. Otherwise, you become egotistical, thinking you thought this all up. Well, you didn't think this all up. You are a block in a building, and you're building the empire of science.
What if I told you that some of the most important scientific breakthroughs in human history happened almost by accident? That a young man from a paper mill town in Pennsylvania would invent a technique that revolutionized molecular biology, not because he had a grand plan, but because his advisor died unexpectedly. And what if I told you that the entire system that made his discoveries possible, a system that has given us vaccines, cancer treatments, and doubled human lifespan, is now under attack? From PHI Media, I'm Gordon Thane, and this is the story of Dr. James Alwine, a virologist whose 50-year career was shaped by what he called a fortuitous moment. But it's also the story of American science itself, how it works, why it matters, and why it's now in danger. You're listening to the Public Health Insight Podcast, your go-to space for all things public health and global health, from the Sustainable Development Goals to the social determinants of health, as well as interesting dialogues about the diverse career opportunities that exist in these fields. Remember to subscribe to the podcast and leave us a rating on Apple Podcasts and Spotify so other people like you can benefit from our content. Dr. Alwine, welcome to the Public Health Insight Podcast.
Well, thank you, Gordon. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate your inviting me.
Absolutely. And I'm excited. We have an action-packed conversation today, and there's no better place to start than, some of your earlier days. I like to have space in the podcast to learn about who's the person that I'm talking to today.
Sure.
How did they become to be that person? And in reading some of the pieces you've written, I learned that you grew up in a paper mill town in central Pennsylvania. And I wanted to know, during those days, as you were a high school student preparing to go to college, what did you think your career would look like at that point?
You know, Gordon, I didn't have a great idea. I knew I wanted to go into science.
Okay,
I
science.
had always enjoyed sciences. I enjoyed my biology class, particularly like my chemistry class. I had a
Okay.
very inspiring chemistry teacher who I think saw my talents in sciences and really encouraged me quite a bit to sort of don't stay in the paper mill town.
Mm.
Go to college. You have a future. That's what I did. I went to a college. It was this a small college, it's not too far from where I grew up. My mother didn't
Mm.
want me to go very far away.
So your options were limited.
And it was also a place they could afford.
Hmm.
Um, Once again, I had great chemistry teachers. And but then I started getting into biology as
Hmm.
well. And then my interest started turning towards biochemistry.
Mm.
And one day I borrowed my roommate's car and drove 11 miles over to Hershey, Pennsylvania,
Hmm.
a chocolate town. And Penn State was building a medical school there.
Oh, okay, okay.
And I walked in and I went up to the biochemistry department, walked down the hall looking at the nice labs and new labs and stuff. And a man came out of an office and said, "Could I help you?" And I said, "I'm interested in graduate school." And I told him about myself and he invited me into his office. It turned out he was the chair of the department.
Hmm.
And he handed me an application form as I walked out. And that was my whole entire interview for graduate school.
What?
I,
So did you go there with the intent to make that happen?
no, I went there with the intent of just seeing the place. I wanted to see the place. I wanted to see a biochemistry department, and I ran into the chairman. It was just one of these wonderful fortuitous things. Then I started out studying genetics. So I was learning my genetics
Hmm.
with E. coli, and we were studying metabolism, which I really liked, metabolism. But then another fortuitous thing happened. My advisor died unexpectedly,
Wow.
and I had to start a new project. And it turned out the microbiology department, which was one floor up, had virology going. And I'd always been interested in viruses.
Mm-hmm.
So I went to the chairman of that department, told him I was interested in learning some virology, and told him I wanted to try and do molecular biology with it. Molecular
Mm.
biology as it was at that time. This was 1970. So molecular biology had not really turned into the revolution of molecular
Right.
biology, hadn't quite yet happened.
Right.
So he was all interested in me doing that because there was nobody in his department that wanted to do that. So that's how I got into virology and stayed in it forever since.
Hold on. Let's pause here. Because what just happened is actually a perfect example of how science really works. Dr. Alwine didn't have some master plan. He boarded his roommate's car, drove 11 miles out of curiosity, and walked into a building. The department chair happened to step out of his office at exactly the right moment and handed him an application form. That was his entire graduate school interview. This might seem random, but this is how many scientific careers actually begin. Not with grand strategies, but with curiosity meeting opportunity. The question is, what kind of system allows these moments to happen in the first place?
Then after that, went to Stanford, which was a quantum leap in my science. Going from Hershey,
Mm,
Pennsylvania to Stanford
wow, yes, I can
Biochemistry
imagine.
Department. Quantum leap in my science. And I got into virus studies there. Along the way, I invented the northern blot. So,
Hmm.
so that was a big part of my career.
When Dr. Alwine casually mentions he invented the northern blot, he's being really modest about something really huge. The northern blot is a technique used in molecular biology labs around the world. If you've ever had a genetic test, been diagnosed with cancer, or benefited from personalized medicine in some way, you've indirectly benefited from this technique. But here's the thing, Dr. Alwine didn't set out to invent it. He was just a graduate student trying to solve a specific problem. That's how a lot of scientific breakthroughs happen. Someone working on one thing accidentally creates something that transforms everything else.
And then it just went on from there. And it's like I had these fortuitous things happen, which I think guided me in the right direction.
Mm-hmm.
Became a well-founded virologist and have been in that ever since. 50 years now, I've been
Wow.
a virologist.
Wow.
And although I'm retired, I still am involved.
Right. So I'm curious to hear you described your journey from narrowing down and sort of what your focus would be in your life's work with virology, molecular biology. I'm wondering too, within the kind of research ecosystem that you were able to benefit from and contribute to, what was that moment when you realized that it was a part of the ecosystem? So you had a small part to play in that ecosystem and that many things had to come together to be able to drive the work that you did.
Yeah. I think very early on, I realized that the history of science, the fact that what I was doing when I go to the literature to start reading about it, there was this extensive literature that went back years and years. So there were many, many people that came before me. I actually wrote you know how you wrote the acknowledgments on your papers? I actually wrote once that I want to thank everybody who contributed to science, all the way back to the guy who invented fire. So
Wow.
that's the way we have to look at it.
Right.
It goes back a long way. And you have to be cognizant of that history. Otherwise, you become egotistical, thinking you thought this all up. Well, you didn't think this all up. You are a block in a building,
Hmm.
and you're building the empire of science.
This idea that Dr. Alwine mentions, that he's just a block in a building, this is crucial to understanding how science actually works. That acknowledgement he wrote once, thanking everybody who contributed to science all the way back to the guy who invented fire. That's not just humility. That's recognizing that every breakthrough we celebrate stands on a foundation built by thousands of researchers over centuries. When we developed the COVID-19 vaccine in record time, we weren't just starting from scratch. We were building on decades worth of research into mRNA, viral proteins, and immune responses. The miracle? wasn't just speed, it was having such a robust foundation that we could move more quickly when we needed to. Now, one of the things that we'll talk about later is around the current landscape with the funding cuts in a lot of scientific programs and research and a lot of those elements for public health as well. But one of the kind of big players in that space is the National Institutes of Health.
Yeah.
Can you talk about, in your work that you've done up to this point, how NIH has contributed to that? Because I want to also set the stage for, what is NIH? Many people might not know what they do.
Yeah.
You talk a lot about in your article about the ivory tower and science happens over here. People don't really know what happens behind the scenes. So as we kind of work our way to that point, let's start
Okay.
with how you personally may have benefited from NIH and then talk about what NIH even is in the first place.
Okay. Well, NIH, the National Institutes of Health,
Mm-hmm.
are a group of institutes which cover all sorts of medical disciplines: the National Cancer Institute, Allergy Infectious Disease Institute, the Eye Institute, which are all dedicated to studies of health. And they fund research, they fund grants. And grants are mechanisms by which we get funding from NIH to support our research. And without NIH funding, research in America would just not work.
Mm-hmm.
We have built up over the last 50 years of NIH, as NIH was working, we've built up an enterprise within the United States made up of universities and research institutes in every state, which benefit from the large amounts of public funds that go into research. I myself would was completely funded by NIH
Mm.
for the nearly 40 years that I had a lab. And
Wow.
even when I was a postdoc, I had NIH funding. So NIH funding was
Mm.
key to my success. I couldn't have done it. I don't think the health of America that we've seen and the health of the world has been so affected by NIH's funding of research. And without that great infrastructure that we have in the United States, we would be the health of America would just go downhill. And I'm
Mm.
afraid that's what's going to be happening. We can talk more about that.
Mm-hmm. And then in doing my research for this, I was fully aware, as someone in science, I'm pretty aware of the NIH, the CDC, FDA, and how all these organizations and entities contribute to the wellness and health of not just Americans living in the US, but around the world, really. And then when you break it down into tangible examples, you learn about the contributions to HIV/AIDS research, the
Oh,
contributions to heart disease research, the vast landscape of medical interventions that are routinely used today that we just maybe take for granted, about
yeah,
how those kind of came to be from those public funding mechanisms through the
yep,
NIH and others.
yeah.
And so you realized a lot of the things that we benefit from now came out of those infrastructures.
You're exactly right. We are living, you said something, people aren't aware of it. And I think this is a key point.
Mm,
We are living in what I like to think of as a golden age of health
mm.
that has been brought about by NIH research, NIH funded research.
When Dr. Alwine talks about living in a golden age of health, he's not exaggerating. Think about what childhood looked like 100 years ago. Polio was a constant threat. Measles killed thousands of children every year. Diphtheria, whooping cough, mumps, those were all just facts of life. Today, most parents never seen these diseases. Not because they disappeared on their own, but because of the vaccines developed through NIH funded research. We've become so successful at preventing these diseases that people have forgotten why we needed to prevent them in the first place.
And we have so many vaccines that we have so many growing numbers of ways to cure cancer.
Mm-hmm.
Heart disease, we were starting to make inroads into curing heart disease. Diabetes, you can just go through the list. all of these have benefited in that we now live at a time when childhood diseases that used to be really bad are no longer here. We have
Mm,
vaccines against many viruses and other diseases. We have treatments for diseases. This all came about by NIH research, NIH funded research. And people have been living with it for so long
mm,
that they think these problems have gone away.
mm,
The problems haven't gone away. And I worry with what's happening at NIH right now with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. being in charge of Health and Human Services and his appointees, which are anti science,
mm,
they're anti vaccine. And we're going to start seeing our health, America's health, deteriorate. It's not going to happen immediately,
mm,
but what's going to be like in 2 years as research has flattened out
mhm, mhm,
and been NIH is going to take a 40% cut if the big beautiful bill happens.
mm,
It's already been 2.7 or $3 billion in research has been taken away from NIH since January 20th.
right, right.
And these cuts are causing significant problems. I talk to my colleagues at the University of Pennsylvania. They talk about how tight things are, how many grants they've lost. And these are really important grants that are looking at stuff like pancreatic cancer.
Mm,
Pancreatic cancer has a terrible 5-year survival rate. And this is a group that's doing great work finding how we might treat, maybe even cure pancreatic cancer. The grant was cut. Now, this is going to terribly affect the health of America over the future.
Let me put this into perspective. When Dr. Alwine says he was completely funded by the NIH for nearly 40 years, he's describing the backbone of American biomedical research. NIH, the National Institutes of Health, covering everything from cancers to eye diseases. In 2024, NIH's budget was about $47 billion. That might sound like a lot, but Americans spend more than that on pizza every year. We're talking about funding that has literally transformed human health outcomes. And Americans spend less on it than they do for pizza.
And if RFK Jr. has his way and starts really limiting or eliminating vaccinations and vaccines, we're going to see all sorts of childhood diseases come back. You're going to see polio come back.
Mm,
We already have a measles um, outbreak, a growing measles outbreak, whooping cough outbreak. The cases of both of those are higher this year than they've been for many years in the past. And that as we go forward, vaccination rates go down among the population, herd immunity.
mm,
That's when herd immunity is when enough of the population is vaccinated that the virus, the pathogen can't spread. That protects the whole population, plus those who are most vulnerable, like the very young and the very old. Herd immunity is going to go down. You're going to see more and more of these diseases popping up: polio,
mm.
measles, whooping cough, diphtheria, um, mumps, um, and then many others. I can't think of them all.
Here's what's happening right now. Measles cases are higher this year, higher than they've been in the last couple decades. Whooping cough is making a comeback. These aren't coincidences. They're the early warning signs of what happens when vaccination rates drop and herd immunity breaks down. Herd immunity isn't just a scientific concept, it's a social contract. When enough people are vaccinated, it protects everyone, especially those who can't be vaccinated. Newborns, elderly people, those with compromised immune systems. As that protection erodes, the most vulnerable pay the price first. That's a lot of the infectious disease stuff. The chronic disease research too is instrumental as well, and I can't help
Yeah,
but think about the steps back that we'll take
yeah,
as a result of. And then I
yes.
learned too about that. Obviously, I'm Canadian. I'm interviewing you. You're based in the U.S., and so it's easy to kind of keep scrolling. Okay, that's happening in the US. It doesn't affect me as a
Well, but
Canadian. But then you learn that the majority of the advancements in biological research and biomedical research happen as a result of those funding infrastructures that are
yes,
driven by the US. That was a bit of a staggering thing that I
yes,
learned.
yes, it has benefited the whole world. And yes, it's benefited Canada. I have many good colleagues in Canada who
Mm,
I've collaborated with in the past, great scientists. But, it's a collaborative effort. We get funding in the United States, we can collaborate with our friends in Canada and
right,
all over the
right,
world,
right.
and it becomes a network, a bigger and bigger network of science. And not all that network's going to fall apart
Mm,
because NIH funding is going to be so badly decreased.
mm,
So, yes, we benefit the world, but the world benefits us as well
mm,
because we can collaborate with great scientists. Yeah, the money, it's happening in the US, but we have our collaborators all over the world,
mm-hmm.
which we couldn't do without. We really need them.
You wrote a piece that got some traction with the national media around some of your thoughts about what was happening. And one of the things that you shared in there was the example of the CAR T cell research
Oh,
for
yes.
childhood leukemia,
Yeah,
which I think is a fascinating and humanized example of how something that could be so abstract and tucked away from public consciousness can one day be the thing that saves your life, your child's life, your sister's life, your uncle, your brother, whoever you deem as important to you. These things that are kind of locked away in an abstract box somewhere can science at its best makes it out to the real world and has real life changing moments for people
right,
like me,
right.
like you. So I think that example of the CAR T cell with childhood leukemia is a great example. Could you talk about more about
Sure,
what story
sure. This actually happened while I was at the University of Pennsylvania.
Mm,
I was also an associate director of the cancer center at the time. So I would hear about the process that these folks, Carl June and his colleagues, were going through over years and years, several years of their research trying to develop this. And they finally got it to the point where they could grow up, take the T cells out of this young girl,
mm,
take them to the lab, modify them so that they genetically modify them so that the T cells would now attack the cancer, the
mm,
leukemia,
mm,
and then they could inject them back in, grow them up in the lab, inject them back into the patient. And it was a very dramatic time when this was happening. They didn't know what was going to happen.
right,
And the little girl got very, very, very sick as the CAR T cells were really going,
right,
attacking her,
right, right,
her,
right,
and they knew how to treat this so that you know she could have potentially died, but they knew
right.
how to treat it so she wouldn't. And then in the morning, as um as Carl June likes to say in the film, the little documentary called Fire with Fire, he likes to say in the morning it was like the clouds cleared and the sun came out
Wow,
and the leukemia was gone. It was
wow.
beautiful. It was just beautiful. It was a beautiful demonstration of the. I'm sorry, I get emotional about this,
No, of
but
course, of
it's a
course.
beautiful demonstration of the power of American science
Mm.
because, yeah, they made CAR T cells,
Let's break down what actually happened. Doctors took this girl's own immune cells out of her body, genetically modified them in a lab to recognize and attack specific cancer cells, then put them back in. It sounds like science fiction, but it's built on decades worth of research. Someone had to discover T cells, someone else figured out how they worked, other researchers developed genetic engineering techniques. The CAR T cell breakthrough wasn't one discovery, it was a culmination of thousands of discoveries, most of which seemed completely unrelated at the time. And now this little girl is a college student having a healthy life in college.
but we were talking earlier about the history of this. Well,
Mm-hmm.
it took hundreds and hundreds of scientists
Yeah.
before that who were
Mm,
making the discoveries in immunology.
mm,
What was what was a T cell, and then all the genetic engineering that came up along the way to make it able to genetically
right.
engineer that cell. So there's masses and masses of research that went on to bring us to that point where
Mm,
this kind of cell could be made and be so successful. And CAR T cells have now been used in um, against a lot of different cancers. The most recent I read about the other day was multiple myeloma.
mm-hmm.
That they've been able to, the CAR T cells are able to keep the patients healthy
Mm-hmm.
for long periods of time um, with this otherwise pretty devastating cancer. So it's
Wow.
an example of how wonderful NIH and the American research infrastructure had worked. And once
Mm,
again, a lot of these contributions came from our colleagues all around the world.
mm,
We have to work together as a global entity
mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
for health.
No, that's a great example, and you emphasize the point about. I think what can happen is, perhaps as an outsider, I might say, "Hey, you've been doing research on this thing for 10 years, and I haven't seen anything. You're wasting our money. We're gonna shut you down." What you're saying is some of the things that have been researched over decades build the scientific
Yeah.
knowledge required to make those quantum leaps to eventually find these breakthrough cures, these breakthrough interventions. And if we take those for granted or even shut those
Yeah.
down,
There's a book. It's a book that my wife is reading, and I don't know the title right now, but basically, I think it's called Silly Science.
mm,
And what it's about is research that was being done that people would look at and say, "Why are you doing that? This is silly.
okay,
Why are you doing that?"
interesting.
And one of the examples is a guy who was studying the bacteria and algae that grow in the hot springs of Yellowstone.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
And so he wondered why can they exist at such high temperatures? And they were existing at higher temperatures than anybody had ever realized life could exist. So he started studying them and found out the enzymes that they have in them are
mm,
function at
right.
really high temperatures. Well, what was the outcome of this? That was Thermus aquaticus was the
Mm,
organism.
yes.
And out of it came all these polymerases, heat resistant polymerases that make PCR possible, that make RT-PCR possible. So somebody went, why are you studying a yellow bacteria in a hot spring? But look what happened.
Mm,
We can't look at anything like it's a silly project.
mm-hmm,
It's gaining knowledge. We're gaining knowledge, and that knowledge is going to take us somewhere
mm-hmm.
useful.
This is such a perfect example of why we can't predict where breakthroughs will come from. Some researchers studying bacteria in hot springs in Yellowstone, people probably thought, why are we funding silly things like this? What's the point? But that pointless research gave us heat resistant enzymes which make PCR possible. PCR is that technique that allows us to amplify tiny amounts of DNA. It's used in crime scene analysis, medical diagnostics, genetic research, and yes, in COVID testing as well. All because someone was curious about life in boiling water. So I want to bring us to our Insight Blitz, which is our rapid fire segment where I will ask
Okay.
you questions or read some brief statements to get your immediate and brief responses. Ready to
Hmm.
start?
Ready.
All right. What's a skill that you learned early in your career that you still lean on heavily today?
Cooking.
Cooking. Oh, I was expecting something that with research,
No,
scientific
no,
rigor. We're going with cooking. Okay.
cooking. Yeah.
Uh,
Well, um, my grandmother
mm-hmm.
taught me to cook,
Mm,
and she was a precise person. You had to
okay.
do everything right.
Mm,
And if you didn't, she'd be mad at you. She wanted to do things right. And it was other things. She was an artist too. And she wanted to, when I would help her with that, I had to do things just right.
Interesting.
So this is what I learned through cooking is when you're in the lab,
Mm-hmm.
do it right. Don't take shortcuts. If you have a protocol, follow the protocol. And she also taught me about troubleshooting. Every now and then something wouldn't come up right in the cooking, and she'd say, "Okay, what did we do wrong here?
Mm.
How can we make this better?" So it was. She was an amazing woman. Had a big impact on my life.
Teaching through cooking, like more general, like life lessons and even professional
Yeah,
lessons through cooking. I like that.
yeah.
That's a great way to do that. An experience or moment in your career that fundamentally changed how you looked about the future.
I think this was when I went from Hershey, but my graduate
Mm. Mm-hmm.
school, to Stanford. It was such a quantum leap. I I doubted my science when I was there. I would be there with people from Harvard and Yale and Cambridge and Oxford, and I was intimidated. But the insight I finally came to is I can talk to these people.
Mm.
I know just as much as they do. My science is as good as theirs is, and it made a big difference. It was a quantum leap in both my
Mm.
confidence and
Yes.
in my science.
Awesome. You're hosting a dinner party with three of your personal heroes. Who's at the table?
Sir Isaac Newton.
Okay. That's a good one.
Let's see. Kurt Vonnegut.
Mm.
I loved Kurt Vonnegut's novels. I loved the way he thought.
Mm-hmm.
And the last one, I think it would be Barack Obama.
Mm.
I think that man is wonderful.
Mm. That's a pretty
So,
good dinner table.
yeah,
And of course, the fourth seat for yourself. So yeah, you can be there.
perfect yourself. Yeah, and you're invited to.
I can come there. I can grab a chair from the corner and just listen in. I'd love to do that.
No, no, you sit at the table.
Okay, I'll have some food too. A hot take that you have about the work that you do that might ruffle some feathers, but you're sticking to it.
Take. Oh, oh. I strongly believe that SARS-CoV-2 came from by zoonosis. It was zoonosis. I don't we're never going to know for sure
Right, right.
because the data is just never going to come. But and I know that ruffles a lot of feathers when
Which
I
it's interesting that that is a hot take.
yeah.
When you said it, I'm like, that's not. I'm like, wait, but yeah, it is a hot take in the climate that we
It,
exist now.
in the climate we are at, the lab leak
Yeah.
stuff is out there all the time. It's still
Yeah.
talked about a lot. Every the New York Times will run a lab leak article every few months
Mm.
because it's clickbait.
It stirs up
It's
some
big
interest.
clickbait.
Mm.
Yep.
Mm. Lastly, the worst piece of advice you've ever gotten.
The worst piece of advice that I ever got was, I think, from my father, who never understood. My father was a smart man. He did not go to college. I'm not even sure he finished high school. And he couldn't understand what I was going to do with this PhD.
Mm.
And he so wanted me to say, well, you have college and you're a chemist. Why don't you come back here to the little town and you can work in the lab at the paper mill? And he really wanted me to take that advice that this is where I belonged. He really
Mm.
wanted me to take that advice. And of course I didn't.
Well, I think it turned out to be a good thing.
I think it
Of
turned out to be a good thing. He was eventually very proud of me.
course, of
He
course.
just didn't. This goes back to the communication.
Of science.
I wasn't at that time able to communicate the importance of what I was doing to him.
Mm-hmm.
And he thought I was going in the wrong direction and I should just come home and settle down.
Fair enough, but glad you didn't, or else we wouldn't
Yeah,
be
I'm
talking
glad I
about
didn't.
what we're talking about
Yeah,
today.
right.
All right, that brings us to the end of our Insight Blitz segment. Hopefully, it didn't scare you away, didn't make you too
No,
nervous in
it was
there.
fun. It was
That's
fun, Greg.
awesome.
I appreciate it.
So, in addition to in my research to understand what's going on, there's these funding cuts that have already happened, and there's a budget that's proposed for the next fiscal year that
Yeah.
would essentially baseline those funding cuts that have taken place as sort of the normal level of funding going forward, which
It's
effectively makes it
gonna
permanent.
gonna take at least 40% out of
Right.
the, and that's almost a death blow.
That's Dr. Alwine's journey from a paper mill town to becoming a world-renowned virologist. From borrowing his roommate's car for an 11-mile drive that changed his life, to inventing techniques used in labs worldwide, to witnessing what he now calls our golden age of health. Coming up next, a system that's under attack. Budget cuts already happening, anti-science sentiment is growing, and researchers working on tomorrow's breakthroughs are losing their funding today. We'll dig deeper on what that means, not just for American science, but for global health. That's next time on the Public Health Insight Podcast. This show was edited by me, Gordon Thane, with additional editing from LaShawn Benedict. Sound design and mixing by myself and LaShawn Benedict. The original music from The Music Room, composed by Tom Fox, licensed from Johnny Harris. The cover art design for our show by LaShawn Benedict. The Public Health Insight Podcast is produced by PHI Media. Thank you for listening to the Public Health Insight Podcast, your go-to space for informative conversations, inspiring community action. If you enjoy our podcast, be sure to subscribe and leave us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. See you in the next one.